Few announcements to start with. Boneyard Work Day on April the 12th, 9 a.m. to noon. Didn't get an announcement of where, but I assume Need a Purpose Center would get you there. But it's time for announcements yet. The YMCA and YWCA have a gentleman coming named Thomas Goki, and he's talking to students about their debt load and how they might avoid it some, and how they might perhaps protest it. That's on 7 o'clock at Latzer Hall on April the 3rd, but also at the noon discussion on April the 4th. They're the two that I wanted to initiate. And so Tuesday we had a field trip with the Natural Area Study Group to the Kickapoo Trail. That's rather exciting for me to do that because we've been at it for a long, long time. Registered with the Surface Transportation for Interim Trail Use Agreement in 1996. But in order to do that, we had to have 20 years of knowing about that corridor and how it connects Champaign-Urbana, which is rather flatland, to Vermilion County, which has a Kickapoo State Park, and a lot of geology underneath that involves fault lines and coal and Carboniferous age activities down deep in the ground. And so there was strip mining, and before that there was pit mining. And so you have a lot of people from Kentucky and Tennessee coming north to mine and to provide food on 5-acre lots for the donkeys and horses and burros that were underneath. So there's something different in Danville that is rather attractive. Even the strip mines are reconstituting themselves, and that's very interesting. Some of the ponds that are left with the strip mining are of different age, so you can sample those strip mines and get an idea of the biodiversity increasing gradually as the years roll by. With strip mining comes a fair bit of acid, a fair bit of sulfur, and so the early strip mine ponds have very few species, but a lot of them, like bloodworms or something, those sorts of creatures. As you get further along, say 75 years, then you're going to have 20 or 30 species and fewer of each domain, and they're going to balance out with each other, and they're going to have associates and a whole ecosystem. The trees begin to go. So we have said a fair bit about the bed from Urbana to St. Joe, where the governor's put $200,000 into the building of the trail, just to keep you in lockstep. The interim trail use agreement starts at Dobbins Drive. At that point, the railroad is about a mile past the yards. So our first stop was opposite Solo Cup, where there's a spur line that goes into Solo Cup, and that line is active from Banner Yards all the way through to Bloomington. at Bloomington, that line meets the fast track from Chicago to St. Louis. But it's not totally intact. The piece between Bloomington and Mansfield is in retirement. It has rail and trees and ties on it, but it's not about to go back to trails. The active part of the line from Urbana goes through to Champaign, picks up a lot of grain at Cargill's, just west of Champaign, takes that commodity, the commodity being corn, soybeans, wheat, not so much wheat here, but corn and soybeans certainly, and goes to Norfolk Southern Line that moves north and south at Mansfield. So there's a switch there that allows you to go north and south. The line from Mansfield through Farmer City, through Leroy and Downs and into Bloomington is in retirement. There are a lot of these railroad beds around, probably too many of them. And when you had plenty of cheap gasoline, you could always transport to or you could engage in non-railroad transportation, but it's very costly. And some agencies decided to preserve their railroad lines. If you went to Bloomington, from Bloomington to Myrna to Anchor, and on up to Hershey, there was a railroad line that was sort of kitty corner across the Jeffersonian Platte. And that picks up grain and takes it to various places. So that was saved. I think they got something like $4 million from the state to help save that line. It's called the Anchor Grain Line. We, in evil intent, we would think that might be also an interesting tourist line. But it does go across several main lines. And when you go across the main line, you have to have a pilot to go across, and you have to have probably a caboose on the end if you don't have a signal system. So it's not the easiest to do that with, but it does go on up to Kempton. And there are interesting little side issues here and there. In Kempton, there's a STEL, which is an independent community that works with plastics for income, but it's a sort of a religious community that's centered around Kempton. Hershey has some of its history associates it with some of the first picture windows. And so you can find these little pieces of history here and there. The historians are quite worried about the Midwest because the Midwest has not saved much of its history. People have come with different ethnic backgrounds, and they haven't always recorded this. Sometimes it's not easy because your name might have been changed at some stage. You may be a mixed puppy and have relatives that are in Germany or England or Ireland or where have you. Even Middle East. It's just a polyglot lot. But somehow, before the baby boomer generation closes out, we need to have some of this history. This week I had a input from David Holman, and he's a person who has voluntarily mapped a lot of the trust areas that we're talking about when you talk about Prairie State Conservation Coalition. And he's been getting accolades for doing that. This allows you to put information in. He can gather up information from your website and put it in. It can probably put in photographs. So this is like Google Earth augmented. So if you go to Google Earth and / Heartland Pathways, the world will move around the symbology, and it'll hone you in on heartland pathways. Hasn't quite finished the job yet. DeWitt County hasn't got to yet, but over and over and over, we have to let people know the resource we have. You can see the Kickapoo Trail is now generating, in the long run, probably will cost about $12 million. Over a period of years. It'll be done in sections. The first section comes with governor money and enhancement money from the federal government to develop 6 mile of trail from Urbana to St. Joe. That will be a segment that probably will go in the next 2 years, because it has to be planned, and some of us who are vitally concerned about the soil and the habitat want to make sure that it's well documented and the pathway is developed linearly so it doesn't destroy that small element of native plants that we have left. We went past a site that I feel is quite untoward at the moment. It's 2 drainage ditches that have been carved out of the railroad bed, and I really want people to know that those drainage ditches, if you put a trail down into them and out, grow things like willow trees and become marshy and untenable as far as a trail is concerned. When you do the same sort of thing with the road, it's not so bad, because the road has asphalt oil and chip, and you go across the site. It's not a swampy site. But when you got a drainage ditch, there's a tendency to put these things they call Missouri crossings, and I want to really see that that doesn't happen. It's already, the soil is piled up, and that sort of soil with its gravel, it can be sold to the township supervisor or what have you. So we watch that. We go to the bridge at St. Joe. It's a relatively new bridge, relatively being probably 40 years or something like that. It's not a done yesterday bridge. It happens to be steel, though, and the steel girders are dangerous as far as preservation of a trail is concerned, because if you set fire to a trestle and you have a little piece of trestle burned, you can go get a tree and get some stringers that are like the counterpart for a steel I-beam. You can replace a portion of it. When you come to steel, if the steel buckles with heat, you have to replace the whole thing. So that needs to be watched. There are people there who heat their hot dogs on that bridge, and it's kind of been a place where people go to picnic. There's been lots of honeysuckle around, and you could hide yourself in bushes, and it's been a playground. But that sort of site needs to be watched for probably the next 10, 15 years, because in the long run, these trails become owned by the community. They realize they're public places, and they watch the young folk and the untoward people who sometimes do strange things, like use these areas as a picnic ground, because now they're accessible. But what's happened is you've lost that protection over a federal railroad, which says thou shalt not be on a federal railroad messing with the soil or the right-of-way. It's not necessarily got teeth in it. You don't usually see a lot of railroad detectives out there checking it out. But if you do something really untoward, like you dump 25 ton of garbage on the railroad bed, very shortly the county board will be calling up the railroad that owns that piece of land, and that will have to be removed. So we haven't got that letter of the law, and locally the new rules have not been put forth, but as you have announced the trail, then people are going to use it, and they're going to use it according to their own rules. It's very vulnerable because it's out in the boondocks sometimes. Sometimes it's right in town, and people use it as a parking lot and for other industrial purposes. The value is approximately half the value of the adjacent farmland, which at the moment is running about $7,000 an acre, and somewhere between 5 and 7. But it's assumed that the railroad line has creosote on it. It has coal and other aberrations that have fallen out of trucks and out of the fireboxes of engines, steam engines. So it's about half the price. But that's why the buying of this railroad bed is now about $120,000. That's somewhere near the appraisal price. The appraisal price gets higher when you get to an urban situation because you have urban territory, and so there you might be paying 10 and 15 and 20,000 an acre for a railroad bed. But you've got to figure that this is a rail banking act, and that the railroad has to return to railroading if required. Now, there's 1,500 of these trails, and that hasn't happened at all yet. Probably 5 or 6 little joints. But we want to remember that railroads have a value. They're doing very well. The technology is good. And you've all heard the CSX ad, which says 1 ton of freight, 1 gallon of gas, 450 miles on the main line. That's not on the sideline, but it's on the main line. 1 driver, 200 cars, 80 miles an hour. You can get a shipping pod from Los Angeles to New York in record time. And there's all sorts of research around that. For instance, if you have a manifest train is one where there's a lot of different cars. You might have a tanker car from ADM, for instance. You might have corn or alcohol in it or something like that. You have chemical equivalents. You might have other forms of railroad, and the attempt is to try and make that train as level as possible, because if you put a car that carries motor vehicles, which is very high, adjacent to an open truck that's carrying a commodity, or it might even be a covered truck, the wind can cause you to lose a lot of, or expend a lot more on gasoline between New York and Los Angeles or other places. So there's a lot of research on that situation. The rails are usually welded, so you don't have steam engine hitting the end of a 33-foot stick rail and causing breakage and weakness in the line. So welded rails are helpful. You don't have the clickety-clack of the blues era when you hear people doing things with trains. But it's done very well. It came in very quickly. It used to be you came from New York by canal. Abe Lincoln moved around from when he was in Congress. He came home by canal, and unfortunately the canals lost out to the railroads. But in the interim between 1844 and probably right up into the 50s, the canals were being used. They weren't being used anymore for people moving, but for a long time the canals moved people, and they were shallow. You had a boat that was probably about 18 feet wide at the most and 100 feet long, and you could load that with corn, but you couldn't load it too much because you had to have a 4-foot drawer or enough water for that boat to float. You also had to have aqueducts so that the boat could go across the stream. So if you wanted to go across the Fox River, you had to have an aqueduct, and that aqueduct should not leak. Early on, it was made out of wood, and later it was made out of steel, and the water flowed. Back up on the Fox River, you would have had a dam which would provide extra water so that there was enough water in the shipping canal to take you down to the Illinois River. So you had a connection in the 1850s between Chicago and the Illinois River. So you could join the Great Lakes and Illinois River. We still have that problem. We have this shipping canal that still exists, and a lot of our gasoline and things like that come up to the shipping canal. And there they actually have to change to a double-hulled shipping container because once you get into the open Great Lakes, you can have waves, and so it's not as quiet as if you come up the Mississippi. You used to have paddle wheelers, lots of paddle wheelers, and they had their moments too, because the river is never the same. The river only has to flood once or twice, and you create a new meander, or you cut through an old meander, and so that paddle wheeler, if it's coming from New Orleans, has to more or less come up a bunch of rapids, because if you went around by the meander, you go around perhaps 15 miles extra time. But if you cut straight through that meander, the gooseneck is going to run with rapids. So you had to have paddle wheelers that could get up steam and go for it. And so they were eventually replaced with railroads too, and often the railroads ran down the rivers. Well, getting back to the railroads, you need to look at all these things. Where the railroads went in, they were north, south, east, and west mostly, but then there were kitty corner railroads that went across the state. Many of those have been taken out, and some of them have been made into short lines. There was one I was looking at a lot just recently, and that was to Cisna Park. If you go over to the east side of the Vermilion County, you'll find an Iroquois County, you'll find a railroad that goes north-south towards Chicago and south. And Cisna Park has a spur line there. It used to go further than Cisna Park, but it's now a short line. And often those short lines are owned by individual elevators and the like. So going back to St. Joe, we watch these lines and where they used to exist. We look at the prairie, and it's really sad the amount of prairie we've lost just east of St. Joe. And it was really quite nice prairie, good soils, and that mile has been mown, and not only mown, I think it's also been herbicided to make sure that the prairie plants don't come back. That's because there's a huge amount of development on the road east of St. Joe. So we look at these sorts of things, look at the town, look at where the old interurban used to come through. The interurban and the main railroad came through at a node so that you wouldn't get too much movement, so you wouldn't have to replace a bridge and put it somewhere else. And we looked at the bottomlands where there's been a nice little drive-in. You can go to St. Joe on a new road, which is not the node road, but it's the road that goes straight. And we have a straight mentality, so every once in a while, if you have something that goes off the beaten path, like going to the node, then you want to straighten it. So had it been straightened, and at St. Joe there has been channelization. The area was very swampy. It couldn't be farmed. It's essential that we have the river straightened across the nice meanders that would go across the flatland. And places like Flatville were where this flatland was very swampy. So if you go, just before you go into St. Joe, there's a nice flatland that is a cut-off meander. There's an artificial drain that goes down under the node where the bridge goes across, and that has been developed by Soil Conservation and Farm Bureau, and Bruce Stickers, who used to be the director of Farm Bureau, is very heavily involved there. And we stopped there to look at bird nests being put out. The trees are planted that are more or less native to the area. And that's about where the trail will stop with the first development. The next, we go outside of St. Joe, and there's this S-shaped bridge. So we go underneath the bridge. The interurban at this stage is to the south of the 150. That means it's adjacent to farmland. So farmland has been able to invade or legitimately buy the area. Sometimes it's because the interurban was south of the main line. Farming could go round the light pole and back in and out and in and out and sort of invade the territory for a few more rows of corn and soybeans. So often you look at the interurban, you can see that. We go to places like cemeteries to see what the ethnology is, to get an idea of who's who before you go to the city council meeting. That's not too mean. That's giving you an idea of the history if you don't know it. You're looking at the farmland. You're looking at farmlands that have been condensed. So that one tree sitting out in the middle of nowhere was at one stage a farmstead, and the buildings that were around the farmstead. And so you've gone from having a functional 80 acres to having a functional 3,000 acres, and even 10,000 acres. If you have a machinery like coming out of John Deere, you used to have a plow, and the plow found its way through the muddy soil and this excellent soil, the rich soil, glaciated soil. You would have a moldboard plow with perhaps 3 or 4 horses there, and the plow would foul up because the steel would not let the tough prairie plants flow past and turn them over so that they could be turned upside down and die. So John Deere was instrumental in making a share that could go under the soil, cut the roots of the prairie plants that are very deep, and then have a coulter in front, a round wheel or a straight cutting edge that would cut the sod, and then you'd have a moldboard that was case hardened so that it would be shiny and would roll over. If you wanted to roll over gently, you had a longer rolling over. If you were in sandy soil, you could use a plow that had a quick turnover, but mostly you were in difficult territory. After a while, you had bigger teams. You might even have oxen that had cloven hooves and could work their way through wet soils, and as a team, you would pull a bigger plow, which would create a drainage ditch. So we're talking about all these sorts of things as you go past places like Flatville and know the history and the ethnicity of, say, the Flatlanders, the Deutschlanders and the Frieslanders, knowing how to drain and then getting the very best soil. You notice as you go up over a moraine, and the moraine is more gravelly, more early in its warming up. Sometimes you can almost get 2 crops in there a year. Not quite in this area, but you're just looking at these things. They're not linear. This is a field trip where you're just looking at what's on either side. Here's an elevator. There we go past the bridge east of St. Joe, and we discuss how to put a bicycle bridge. A bicycle bridge can be light, hiking, biking. You don't have to have something that carries a semi-trailer. So the bridge at just east of St. Joe over the Union Pacific is the road bridge is fairly substantial and fairly recent, and it became into action before there was a outrigger for bicycles or hiking people. But you go over, and then the interurban tends to be on the, or doesn't tend to be, it is on the north side of the road, between the road and the main line. That's advantageous to us because it doesn't get dug up it's not adjacent to the farmland anymore, it's adjacent to the road. And so the area between the road and the main line is the 37 feet of the interurban, and that's got the original soil we're looking for and the prairie. So we go to Muncie, and that's Ogden then first. Ogden has a connection with the interurban. You used to go down to Old Homer Lake. So we went south just a little bit before we get to Ogden and go down to the new Homer Lake and then to the legal trail, which was the Lincoln Trail, where Lincoln is, you would be a judge, probably Judge Davis from Leamington, a friend of Lincoln's, and Lincoln would be presenting his clients. They have a tree which for years was a cottonwood tree, and it gradually died, and cottonwoods aren't that long-lived. And there was a stump, and there's still a memorial stump at the new Homer Lake, so why is there a new Homer Lake? Well, it was dammed, and that there was an area where you could dam it without having the dam go back for 80 miles and be 4 inches deep. There was a little bit of terrain there, so Homer Lake, the new Homer Lake, is there because there was a conservation dam, which was eventually given to the Forest Preserve, which is the logical agency that not only controls that lake and the area around it, but also controls the railroad that we're talking about, the Kickapoo Trail. So we come back up to Ogden. There was a tornado went through there, so there's no elevator there anymore. You can still, if you know what you're looking for, you can still see the buildings that have been repaired after a huge tornado. And I can remember that I had cards at the visitor center at that time, and some of our cards were spread around the fields, and there was a trailer home there that got shifted by the tornado, and there was a toilet sitting by itself out in the middle of the field. And so you go to Ogden and you realize that that's available. For those who are practical and come to field trips with enough coffee that they have to go, you have to stop at places like Ogden to let people go to the toilet, and you have to run up towards 74, which is only about a mile distance from 150. So just remember there's a convenience in here. So we're going past Ogden, and we're almost to the Vermilion County line. There's Mr. Esworthy, I think. Just on the outskirts, or the eastern outskirts of Ogden, and he's got good soil. The trail has good soil, and that is a site where Mr. Esworthy would like to farm, and so we've had some conflict with Farm Bureau and discussions about who gets what, where, and the fact that the Rail Banking Act quiets the titles means that we do have access to the titles, and if a train needs to come back, it can. So we should look after the trail so that we don't destroy the railroad base. The railroad can always put back in. What the railroad can't do easily is put in a new railroad with new real estate. That's going to be very, very costly. So to preserve these railroad beds is good. And there's like 1,500. And the recreators really don't appreciate this putting in a trail and then losing it, and they don't. They'll probably have it for 50 or 100 years. We're still in the stage of getting the technology straight as to how you feed into hubs. There's a hub in Chicago, hub about 300 miles. Every 300 miles, you load trains with shipping crates that are an internationally standard size, so you can put 2 on each rail car. The train never comes apart. You unload it with a gantry crane. And you have to have, like the bridge over the Union Pacific, has to be high enough to take 2 crates. And it has to be across 3 railroad lines because they exchange trains there or park trains while one train goes past the other. So that's very costly. And no way are the attorneys associated with the railroad line, there's probably about 15 of them, they do not want hikers and bikers crossing the line at grade. So we're now moving into Vermilion County. The next little town is Rumpler with a square elevator. We looked at that, and there's a little community there. And in the past, you would have had that. Then DeLong is the next site. And just we traveled along, and we're very glad to have a second-hand Chrysler, which is can take 8 people. We didn't actually have, I had the back seat out, but so I had other cars behind. It makes it, you have to get out and speak to the cars, and it's not easy to park those sorts of cars. So having a vehicle like this is very helpful to us to not only be able to take passengers to a field trip, but also to be able to take the back seat out and put equipment in them. So that's a new event for us. We had to wait several years before we had money enough to put a transmission in the vehicle, but it's already proved its value. And it was doing so with the Natural Area Study Group. Going through Fithian, we've had a lot to do with saving an interurban station, and that we inspected, and on further to Muncie, where there used to be gob piles. A gob pile is where underground, where you didn't have strip mining yet. You pulled the overburden out and got your coal, but you had these nice piles of very colorful piles because there's enough sulfur to give you yellow colors, and it's sedimentary soil. But those gob piles have been taken out anymore at Stony Creek, which is just east of Muncie. So the Stony Creek there has been modified so that it takes a square bend before it goes under 150 and makes a cut-off meander. Well, you can't take the S-shaped what would you call it? The physical configuration of water as it flows is in a meander, and so at that point we notice the riprap that's been added. You go past a high school, we go past a site where farmers invade, and we've had to replant and keep reminding people that they don't belong to the railroad right away. Go through the Bronson, where there's a township garage, and a little bit of herbiciding there. This is a corridor that Doris Westfield picked seed for the Vermilion County Conservation District Prairie. So it's very rich in prairie. On the south side, the road moves over to the north side again, and so the south side is vulnerable. So the railroad has been invaded by the farmland on the south. And when you get to Oakwood, you're getting the feeling that we have to have our town mown. So we usually don't violate that. But when the mowing starts to go out and out and out and out and out, it takes out a lot of prairie. So we want to maintain that prairie. Where there's been sightings, we observe that the four-wheelers have been using the sideline because it's got gravel on it, and you can screw around on it. But just at the end of the section road, just east of Ogden, Oakwood, there's somebody parks their vehicles right on the railroad bed. So you have to have someone that is fairly strong to check this sort of behavior, and it might be Christmas trees on the right of way, or just have to be this early stage of a trails development, be cautious. To the south, there is Mission Field and the pollywogs. So we look out over the pollywogs, and they're old enough that they start to have birds and bees and what have you, and you can look over. It's almost a place you don't want to fall down, because you would go into a trough. There's 60 feet of water. It's very dark. It's not clear water. It's strip mine water, and you can probably put a canoe in it and enjoy, but you wouldn't want to swim in it so easily. And if you do swim in it, you've got to know your onions, because those when you have a pond like that, the water will turn over. There's a convection in ponds, and you can have some very cold water at the top of the pond, and if you go swimming in that sort of thing, you can lose your life, because your muscles all tense up. And so if you do be tempted to swim in a strip mine pond, just be careful. To the south, we went to Conkytown. Conkytown used to have a covered bridge. It had a raceway, a long raceway, and the water ran a grist mill. And it's on the Jordan Creek, which comes into the Salt Fork. And Jordan Creek has a lot of Natural History Survey people there that on the banks of the Salt Fork Creek. And it's obvious where they are, because there's bird nests and whatnot in the fields, and the fields are allowed to go back to nature. And Conkytown is being expanded a little bit, but I wish it would expand with a covered bridge if they could recreate, and a grist mill if they could recreate. The raceway is there, so you go from one. It's like the meander that had to be negotiated with a paddle wheeler. If you cut across a large meander, you have enough fall in the water that you can run a wheel and have a grist mill. Otherwise, you have to have horses that turn the mechanisms which grind the grain. And often there's, like at Monticello, you'll have a couple of stones that were the grindstones for grinding grain. And probably you got a little bit of gravel in your grain at times, so you may have worn your teeth out a little sooner. So we went round Jordan Creek, and then you come up on the south side of Jordan Creek, and you're at Catlin. And it's very dramatic when you get to the edge of the riparian way, the river area. The agriculture is right up to the point where it can't go anymore, because if it's bottomland, some people used to work the bottomland, and they still do, but you have to have a polder. You have to be able to pump the water out, or you have to face the fact that once every 3 or 4 years you're going to be flooded, so you're not going to get a crop. But you come out, and back to the north again, and look at the overhead bridge across the Salt Fork of the Vermilion, very near to Kickapoo State Park, quarter mile long, 160 feet off the ground. So that bridge is going to take about $2 million to repair it to this point where you have a fence along the side so bicycle people can go across without fear, and the bed has to be boarded so that you don't necessarily see down 160 feet. People that are not used to heights don't like to do that. So the fairground is nearby. There's an underpass where the road goes under the railroad line, and that's kind of interesting. There is access to Kickapoo State Park, but then you get to Hillary. You're going over 74, you're going north, and to some extent the line actually stops there, and the railroad yards, which are east of, on the west side of Danville, but on the east side of our railroad bed, then the railroads usually keep a track a mile back from their yards so that they can park trains if necessary. A long train may be 200 cars. You're longer than a mile long then. So that's kept. So the railroad is active from the fairgrounds through Hillary. Hillary is built up against the railroad line, so you have to go out onto 150 and go around to Henning Road. Henning Road is where you usually go to get access to the Kickapoo State Park. And the Henning Road, you go along a little bit and then duck down into Hillary. And we have to figure out how to go through Hillary, because when you walk through Hillary, there are lots of dogs that are not awfully friendly. And you're impinging on local people, and that's where you face the rape and mayhem syndrome. That the visitors are going to come with bicycles that have the ability to take refrigerators and television sets and rape your daughter, and that is often a ploy for not having a trail. It's only about probably a mile long, and you get back onto a road that goes right up to Danville. So we traveled that and looked at how you might get into Essery Park, that is at the venture to Danville, and you have there a historic museum and a house from which Abe used to harangue the crowd, and the Richters work on that museum for a long time, and so we know people over there. Kevin Green has a bunch of railroad ties stored in his front yard that we hope to go to one. So, which reminds me that was looking at the Kickapoo Trail. We need more people to do more field trips to be familiar with these little bits and pieces and where things go. You need to be able to know where the railroad bed goes from Danville to Crawfordsville. It's consumed. So if you were ever going to put back the railroad or a trail, you need to do something about that. So actually knowing about this, so the Grand Prairie Friends and the Natural Areas Study Group, these are people who know their onions, they know their birds, they know their natural history. The Natural Areas Study Group especially has been in action for about 35 years. And they have a very active group. If you go to an organizational meeting, and there'll be probably about 30 people there, on a field trip on a cold day is not nearly as many, but that's okay. They get to know natural areas and be able to transmit that information to other people. So we need more of that, and we need to be able to talk to the owners of the corridor, the Forest Preserve in Champaign County and the Conservation District in Vermilion County. Dan Olson is the manager for the Champaign end, and Ken Constance is the director of the Vermilion County Conservation District. And there will have to be quite a bit of planning before the implementation of the trail. One of our concerns is that we need the documentation of the prairie and what's taken over by forest that is not prairie, and what should we keep and what should we restore, and how should we get the rail to be developed linearly and not have your bulldozer sitting on valuable prairie. So we need a documentation of that corridor. Okay, we got a few more minutes. I want to go back to the other 33-mile railroad bed we have in the Monticello area. We're not quite sure how to get into Champaign, but we have 4 miles between Seymour and Whiteheath, which is the trees have been removed on it now, so it shortly we hope will be an active trail from Seymour to Whiteheath. If you're riding a bicycle, we don't suggest that you go to Route 10, you go up Kirby Avenue and you avoid some of the traffic that is on Route 10. But basically we get to Whiteheath and the railroad bed goes down past Shady Rest, across the Sangamon, up to Lodge, across to DeWitt, Weldon, Lane, and the Clinton itself. We own that bed, and we hope that it will be a counterpart to the bed that you're looking at Kickapoo State Park. So activation of the Kickapoo State Park will be helpful and a demonstration that we can do other things at other places. But if you look at Whiteheath, the Railroad Museum owns 7 miles of the same corridor, and then we start again from Monticello into Cisco, around by Allerton Park. The interesting thing there is that from the end of the western end of the Railroad Museum site, or on the west side of Monticello downtown, we own the railroad bed that goes over the Sangamon. We own a truss bridge there. So we've worked with the Monticello City to put in a nice trail there. So I'm encouraging some of you to go look at that trail and enjoy it. You can get access to it easily from the sewer plant end on the Monticello end, or you can go over the Sangamon on Bridge Road, or come into Bridge Road from 72 and go down to on Country Farm Road and find a nice access to an established trail that's done very well. It had some of the problems that we're talking about of surveillance. When young folk went down there because, you know, once you open a trail, you open it to the public and you expect involvement. Well, they got involvement and a section of the bridge trestle was taken out by accident, but it reminded people that they do own a trail and that they should become the public caretakers of it. Instead of having bollards at the end of the trail, they'd put a nice big concrete block that you see used on roadsides often, and that prevented fire departments from getting into the fire. So now there's bollards there that you can unscrew and put them down so that a heavy-duty truck can go down the trail. We hope that that will extend from County Farm Road round towards Allerton Park, and we hope that a 4-mile trail will go in from there along to Cisco. Again, the railroad is active from Cisco into Decatur. and there's a railroad back about a mile back from the elevator at Cisco, where we encounter that. Okay. So I think that gives you an idea that I'm looking for people to go out and look and see and find out what's going on and what's shady rest and can you enjoy shady rest in the spring and da-da-da-da-da-da.